All right, everybody, welcome back to the Horn Takes podcast, your very rough around the edges Texas sports talk destination. I'm your host, Sean Redfern. We've been off a couple days, man. We've been putting together some stuff to try to make this Sugar Bowl deep dive a little deeper, a little more special since we got the time, right? Merry Christmas Eve to everybody out there. I love Christmas, man. It's probably my favorite time of the year, like from a holiday perspective. I don't know, man. Just always have really loved Christmas. Love it today. Loved having kids. Loved being a kid through Christmas. Loved having little kids through Christmas. Our kids are older now, so it's not quite as exciting as it used to be. But we still have a good time. Still enjoy it. I love it all, man. I love the movies. I love the music. I love the lights, the tree, the decorations. I'm a huge dork for Christmas. Next year, I'm going to have me a nice Christmas tree in here in the studio with all kinds of Texas Longhorn ornaments and orange lights, all that crap. It's going to be legit. Can't wait. It's Deep Dive Thursday. Today on Deep Dive Thursday, we'll do a little bit of National Signing Day thoughts. We'll obviously start our deep dive on the Washington Huskies. We'll have Sean's 4 big questions of the game heading into this Sugar Bowl. And then we'll have some random college football thoughts just on some news out of the college football world today. Check us out on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube at Horn Takes. You can listen to the podcast if that's your thing. You just like to listen to podcasts, horntakespodcast.buzzsprout.com or anywhere you listen to podcasts. National Signing Day has come and gone. Actually, I think there's still a couple more days today and tomorrow that recruits can technically sign their national letter of intent during the early signing period. For all intents and purposes, this early signing period has now become National Signing Day. The February National Signing Day is no longer National Signing Day. And on National Signing Day, all kinds of crazy stuff happens. You win some, you lose some. That's just the way it goes. That's the way it goes in this recruiting world. Long gone are the days that Mac Brown would have an entire class wrapped up at junior days the year before they graduated or that spring headed into a season. You just don't see it. It just does not happen anymore for hardly anybody, really. And even the guys that get commits with NIL and all that stuff, so much has changed. Where these players can now, they've always been able to back out of a commitment until National Signing Day, but I think you see it a lot more today than you might have used to seen it. It's all National Signing Day. Texas flips a couple of really big prospects. 5-star safety Xavier Filsame out of McKinney, Texas, flips to Texas from Florida. Been a Florida commit for, I think, since April of this year. Texas got in on him really, really late. But I think Texas's successful season, along with Florida's not successful season, and just the fact that Sark and staff are just really good recruiters and really good closers, probably made up the difference in that recruitment. Definitely glad to see Xavier on the right team. We got 4-star linebacker Ty Anthony Smith, who was committed to A&M and never decommitted from A&M, as far as I know. He signs his letter of intent with Texas yesterday evening, I believe, about 6:30 is when his announcement and signing was. Ty Anthony Smith is a dude that he's listed at 6'1", 205. To me, he looks a lot bigger, even on his junior film. I haven't seen any of his senior film, but his junior film, he looks a lot bigger than 6'1" to me. I mean, he looks like a 6'2", 6'3" type guy that's just long and rangy. Not sure. Maybe everybody on his team is just really short. I don't know, but he looks quite a bit bigger than 6 foot 6'1" to me. Anyway, I guess we'll find out. And then, of course, you lose some. Texas loses out on 4-star athlete Aaron Hampton out of the Dangerfield ISD. Man, Aaron Hampton is a weird dude, man. He was committed to Texas a long time ago. Decommits from Texas. Commits to Alabama. Here in the last, I don't know, couple months, he decommits from Alabama, commits to Texas, and then right before signing day, there started to be all this buzz that he was, that Alabama was really still coming after him hard, and there was a possibility he was going to flip. Sure enough, he flips. So he is a Crimson Tide. My thoughts on that, man. He's a great player, 100% a great player, and he may go to Alabama and fit in just perfectly and have a great career at Alabama. But the way this guy has flipped his commitments multiple times, you got to just think it's going to be tough to keep him anywhere he would have landed. I think it would have been tough to keep him very long. I think this guy has transfer portal like written all over him, and I'm not being critical of him. I just think so many kids today are just such short attention spans, and really, what have you done for me lately? And just the grass is always greener on the other side. That's just my initial thought on this Aaron Hampton kid. Again, he may go to Alabama and do amazing things and stay there 4 years. Hopefully, gets a degree, all that good stuff. But we wish the best for Aaron Hampton. Kind of glad though I don't have to be on that roller coaster ride with Aaron Hampton anymore. Dominic McKinley's a guy that did not sign with Texas A&M yesterday, although he's still committed. There's a lot of buzz that he's going to stretch this out until February. I did see one report that he may sign this week. Don't know who that would be. I know Texas was in the running for him like late summer, right up until the time he committed to Texas A&M. I just don't know what since then looks like. I'm sure the staff has been in contact with him to this point. Just a really weird deal. So I don't know. Dominic McKinley would be huge for Texas. That would punch Texas probably into the top 3 in just high school recruits ranking, and maybe number 1 recruiting class overall, depending on how the rest of the transfer portal stuff goes. Here's a name that I just saw this morning or late last night. 4-star wide receiver Aaron Butler out of California got a late offer to Texas. Probably when Aaron Hampton said, I'm going to Alabama is when that happened. I know Sark was out there for a recruiting visit, did an in-home with him a couple weeks ago, but did not get an offer at that point. This guy's been really heavy into Arizona and Washington here lately. Texas is right there. Supposedly the dad really likes Sark. So I don't know, man. He has obviously not yet signed. But again, possibility he signs all the way up until Friday. Don't know. This class today sits at number 5 with just high school recruits, number 3 overall with the transfers. And the transfer portal piece is not done. Still very much in the mix for Trey Moore, the outstanding edge from UTSA. And then I don't know how good of a shot it is. I don't even know if there's mutual interest. Evan Stewart's still sitting out there. And there's probably some other guys as well that the Texas staff is having conversations with that are in the portal. You look at this class. I love this class, man. I love everything Steve Sarkisian has done since he's been at Texas and since he's had these full recruiting cycles. He's now on his 3rd full recruiting cycle. And I just think that dude and his staff, they got it figured out. There are 8 of 22 signees are offensive line or defensive line. I love it, man. That's like what, 30%? Almost 30%? Actually more than 30%. 5 defensive linemen, obviously led by the key piece, that 5-star edge, Colin Simmons out of Duncanville, Texas. And then 3 O-linemen. If you guys know anything about recruiting and have followed anything about Texas recruiting, obviously 2 years ago was like one of the biggest hauls of offensive linemen ever seen in the history of recruiting. And it was absolutely necessary. But I love how Sark keeps stacking all this talent on the offensive line and defensive line. The 3 O-lineman, 5-star offensive tackle, Brandon Baker, sort of the gem out of that group. And you say that defensive line and offensive line are really hard to project. Obviously, those 2 guys are very, very talented, or they wouldn't be 5 stars. But a lot of times 3 stars and 4 stars even, and really I should have said that the other way, 4 stars and 3 stars even turn out to be some of your best players. You just don't know how these big guys are going to project because they're huge in high school. They're so much bigger, so much stronger, and a lot of instances just so much more athletic than everybody on the field that you can't tell how good they're going to be. You can't tell if they're just winning on athletics, and when they get to high or get to college rather, are they still going to be that much more dominant physically? So a lot of it comes down to development, and you start to see these guys. Tavondre Sweat is a 3-star, folks, and he's about to be a #1 draft pick. Won a whole bunch of awards, is a unanimous All-American. And man, that's just all development. That's just all him putting in the work and the coaching staff putting in the work with him. So really, you never know. You always want to have 5-star guys, as many as you can get. That's what you want. But the point being, sometimes the 5-star guys don't pan out, and sometimes it's the 3 and 4-star guys that really show up and kick ass. Trey Moore is expected to sign with Texas and make this group of 8, 9 of offensive linemen and defensive linemen. He's probably a perfect example of that. I bet you Trey Moore wasn't a 4-star, might not even been a 3-star. He goes to UTSA, develops a little bit, and had 14 sacks last season. So Texas filling needs on the offensive line and the defensive line. You want to keep those rooms stacked. They got some help on the back end of the defense. They got 5 DBs from high school in this class, led by 5-star Xavier Filsaime, the late flip. And then they brought in 4-star safety transfer Andrew Mukaba from Clemson to make it a 6th. So there you go. 15 of the 22 guys are out of 2 groups, and 2 groups where the back end was certainly in need. I don't know that Texas needed to get any more elite talent on the offensive line and defensive line. Definitely at edge. We need some help at edge. But offensive line, there's a lot of talent, and it's a lot of young talent. But you always want to, again, keep stacking talent on those 2 areas for sure. But then they go and get all this meat on the back end of the defense where they certainly need some help. Wide receiver has been a position of need. It's going to be a position of need in 2024. You probably got Worthy, Mitchell, and Whittington all gone. Whittington has to be gone. Worthy and Mitchell have not yet announced whether they are going to go pro. If Sark gets those guys to come back, or if they decide they're coming back, that might be the ultimate coup of all time. Might be bigger than Mac Brown pulling in Vince Young. That would be huge. But I think it's really safe to say those guys are gone. But they pulled in 4 pass catchers in this class, led by 5-star wide receiver Ryan Wingo. And then they go out in the transfer portal and get 4-star transfer wide receiver Matthew Golden from Houston. So there's 5. So really, you look at 3 different position groups, and you got 20 guys in this recruiting class from those 3 different position groups. And that was all planned, folks. That is what Sark and this staff do. Texas needed to add depth at linebacker with the departure of Jalen Ford. They go out and flip Aggie commit Ty Anthony Smith. You always need some QB depth, right? You gotta probably bring in a quarterback at least once every class. I mean, I think you just can't afford to not do that. And they added some QB depth with Trey Owens. And Trey Owens, folks, he might be the hidden gem in this class. He's been a 3-star forever. He's been committed to Texas forever. And he just picked up his 4-star recently. This guy's big, and he can sling it. I wouldn't be surprised one single bit if Trey Owens ends up being the starting quarterback at some point in his career at the University of Texas, and does amazing at that position. Again, this is what Sark and this staff do. They're not chasing stars. They're not even chasing like top recruiting classes. They're out there looking for the best players they can find across the country to help them fill needs on the roster for the next season and off into the future. Like Sark is playing chess A lot of people are playing checkers. He can see the future. He's got a crystal ball. He's got a magic 8 ball. I don't know what it is. He just knows I'm going to need this, this, and this 1 to 2 years down the line. And that's the way he starts recruiting. And that's his high school guys. And then he sprinkles in a little bit of transfer portal to fill in the gaps. And bam, man, you got a hell of a roster. The two weaknesses on this Texas team in 2023 are pressure off the edge on defense in the back end of the defense. They got the best edge in the 2024 class out of high school. And then again, Trey Moore, if he signs, which he's totally expected to, 14 sacks last season at the collegiate level. You got your 5 DBs, 3 of those guys, top 300 players. And again, you just look at the way Sark and this staff are very strategic about recruiting and using the portal. This is why it's only taken Sark 2 seasons, 2 recruiting cycles of his own to put Texas in the college football playoff and sort of back on the map. The dude knows what he's doing. Go back and look at 2022 when he got here. They went trench warfare hard. 15 of the 28 high school recruits in that class were offensive line, defensive line. And then they went and plucked Quinn Ewers out of the portal. Linebacker depth was a huge deal headed into this 2023 season. 5 out of the 25 high school recruits in the 2023 class were linebackers. Obviously headed up by 5-star Anthony Hill, who's had an amazing freshman year so far. And then you sprinkle in a little bit of Adonai Mitchell in the portal, who has had a huge impact, massive, colossal impact on this team this year. One of the things Mack Brown started to do towards the end of his tenure at Texas, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, he'd have these classes wrapped up. He would decide, these are the guys I need, and he'd get them all committed. And he was amazing at keeping guys committed for like a year and then getting them to sign. He did that really well. The problem was he wasn't taking into account that some of these guys have reached their peak and some other guys are going to continue developing. And the other thing Mack Brown just really didn't want to do was go out of state. He just did not like to go out of state. He had really good relationships with the Texas high school football coaches. And I understand why. I mean, Texas is a very fertile recruiting ground. Texas could probably, if Texas could keep the best players in Texas at the University of Texas, they'd be able to compete every single year. But the reality is that's just not going to happen. You're always not going to keep the best players in Texas. You got to go outside the borders of Texas. And man, Steve Sarkisian and his staff, they are definitely not fenced in by the border of Texas. They're all over the place looking for the best players, and they've got relationships across the country. So watch out Nick Saban and watch out Kirby Smart. I know Texas has been right behind those 2 schools the last few recruiting classes. Let this team make it to the college football final, and then let this team figure out a way to win that college football final. The recruiting world better watch out, man, because Sark is already stacking talent. And if he has that under his belt, he's going to be into the next phase. The next problem for a head coach is, okay, I got there. How do I stay there? How do I keep bringing in all these big time recruits, which he'll have no problem doing, but how do I get them to come in and buy into the culture that, like, you're not that good? Yeah, I know you're a 5-star. I know you're all 5 stars and 4 stars, but y'all aren't that good. Y'all ain't proved shit. And that's what Nick Saban has been so good at on this run with Alabama. And I don't know how he does it. I honestly do not understand. I would love to go just follow him around for like a whole offseason and just see how he interacts with the team and understand how he convinces these guys that are all badasses that they're not, and they got to keep working. And if they don't work, they're not going to play there, but they're not going to win shit. Watch out. Sark's coming. Not coming like Deion Sanders. He's going to actually come and get recruits. He's going to actually come and win championships and things like that. All right, y'all, it's Deep Dive Thursday. We got to get into this matchup between Texas and Washington in the Sugar Bowl, January 1st. Let's start out with the offense. We always start out with the offense, and we start off with the rushing. Texas rushes for 189 yards per game. Texas's opponents give up 156 yards per game on average. Texas has a plus 33 offensive run margin, which is really good. Washington, they only rush the ball 125 yards per game. Their opponents give up 132 yards per game on average. So they've got a -6 offensive rushing margin, which is not good. Anytime on offense, you're a negative number, and on defense, you're a positive number. Probably not good for you. Passing, Texas passes the ball 287 yards per game. Their opponents yield 231 yards per game on average. They have a plus 56 offensive passing margin. Washington, we know they pass. They got Penix. They got that host of wide receivers. 344 yards a game this offense averages. Their opponents only yield 249 yards per game on average. They have a plus 95. And I've been doing these little breakdowns this way probably since about halfway through this season, maybe a little sooner than halfway through this season. I've never seen a passing margin that big offensively, but we'll get into why it looks that way in a little bit down the line, down a little bit longer in this show. We'll talk about that. Scoring, Texas scores 36 points per game. Their opponents give up 26 points per game. They got a plus 10 scoring margin, which is good. It was plus 14 headed into the final week of the season, I think. Something like that. Washington scores 38 points a game. Their opponents give up 27 points per game. They have a plus 11 scoring margin. So you look at it offensively, just those three major categories. Texas has a clear lead rushing. Washington has a clear lead passing. And in scoring, they have a slight lead in scoring margin. Sacks, Texas has allowed 26 sacks. Washington only 11 sacks. That's a really good number. That is less than 1 sack per game. So that offense, that means one of either two things, and it probably means both. That offensive line is really good in pass protection, and they get the ball out pretty quick. Because even with a good offensive line, you can't just hold the ball forever. It just ain't gonna happen. Turnovers lost. Texas has lost 16 turnovers this season. Washington has lost 17. Tackles for loss allowed. Texas allowed 66 tackles for loss. Washington only allowed 46 tackles for loss. So you look at those two stats, you look at tackles for loss and sacks, and you got to just go, man, Washington just got a pretty good offensive line, it seems like. Third down offense, Texas converts almost 39% of the time, and Washington converts 48% of the time. Red zone offense, Texas scores 80% of the time. Washington scores 86% of the time. So you look at it offensively, pretty even in a lot of spots. Texas has an advantage running the football. Texas has an advantage. And actually, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. Texas is trailing just a bit behind Washington in every other offensive category. Defensive stats, and this is where, and we've said this like, I don't know, probably 5 times this season as we do these things. This is where Texas really separates themselves from Washington defensively. Rushing, Texas only giving up 81 yards per game on the ground. Their opponents gain 152 yards per game on the ground. They have a -71 defensive rushing. I mean, they give up on average 71 less rushing yards than their opponent gains on average. Washington 134 yards given up on defense on the ground. 146 is what their opponents run per game. So they have a -12, which is good. I mean, it's negative. It's not far negative, but it's negative. Passing, Texas giving up 240 yards a game through the air. Their opponents gain 246 yards per game through the air. They got a -6 passing margin, which it's been positive for the last couple weeks. They just now got back into the negative. I think part of that is just some injuries. We'll talk about that a little later. Passing for Washington, they give up 263 yards per game. Their opponents only give up 259 yards per game. So they got a +4 defensive passing margin, which means not good for them. They're not a good pass defense. Scoring defense, Texas giving up 18 points a game, roughly. Their opponents average 30 points a game offensively. They have a minus 12 defensive scoring margin, and that's outstanding. I mean, that's almost 2 touchdowns. It's definitely 2 scores. I think anytime you give up on average 2 scores less on defense than your opponent's score, that's really good. Washington, they give up 23 points a game. Their opponents score 30 points a game. They have a minus 7 defensive scoring margin, which I also think is pretty good. Sacks, this is, man, as good as Washington's offensive line is at preventing sacks, their defensive line is bad at getting sacks. Texas has 32 sacks this year. An improvement from last year, not by a whole bunch rather. But even these 32 sacks are not elite. I think to get into the elite category, you got to be in the 40 range. Washington only has 19 sacks this entire season. Turnovers forced, Texas forced 23, so they have a +7 turnover margin. Washington is only forced 18 turnovers, so they only have a +1. Tackles for loss, huge gap here. Texas has 82 tackles for loss. Washington has 57 tackles for loss. Third down defense, pretty big gap here. Teams only convert on Texas on third down 26% of the time. They convert 40% of the time against Washington. Red zone defense, Texas only giving up scores 71% of the time. Washington giving up scores 84% of the time. So another pretty big gap there. Defensively, it's not even close. And we'll talk a little more as we dive a little deeper into this stuff in a minute. Strength of schedule. Texas's strength of schedule, and these are all Sagarin ratings. Texas has the number 2 ranked strength of schedule in the country. Washington has the 12th ranked strength of schedule in the country. If you look at the opposing teams' opponent's strength of schedule for each team, for Texas, their opponent's strength of schedule would land right at 32 in the country. Washington right at 37 in the country. So pretty close there on strength of schedule. But again, there hasn't been a time this season, and I think maybe at some point early in the season, Alabama had a better strength of schedule, and they may now too. But that's the only one for Texas where they haven't had a tougher strength of schedule. Now let's do a deeper dive. So we scratched the surface. We've decided that, offensively, Texas runs the ball a lot better than Washington runs the ball. But after that, Washington pretty much has a clear advantage. And then defensively, we decided that Texas pretty much just has a clear advantage in all defensive categories. But so what we did was we broke down all those categories into sort of subgroups. We got the total, which is what we just talked about. And then we kind of broke it out by the top 5 teams in each category. So, for example, offensive run margin, what we do is we go and we get all the teams Texas has played. We get their rushing yards per game, and then we average that all out. And that's the average for the entire season's opponents for Texas running the football. So we took the top 5 of those in each category. So defensive rushing, defensive passing, defensive scoring, all that. And we took those top 5 teams for each category, averaged them out just to kind of see how the overall average compared to that average. And then how those averages between each team compared to each other. And then we averaged out the out-of-conference games, which generally tend to be weaker opponents. And then we averaged out the conference games. And so what we found was pretty interesting. Offensive run margin, Texas dominates this category across the board. They're plus 22 against the top 5 and plus 8 out of conference, plus 40 in conference. So they actually improve against tougher opponents. Washington, negative overall, but plus 21 against the top 5 on their schedule. So if you look at their offensive rushing margin, it's negative for the total. It's negative for out of conference, and it's actually even for conference play. But they were plus 21 against the top 5 rushing teams on their schedule, or excuse me, top 5 rushing defensive teams on their schedule. Oregon twice. Oregon twice, a lot of places here for Washington because they played them twice. And that Oregon team figured into the top 5 a bunch of times in each of those categories. Offensive passing margin, Washington absolutely dominates this category. They're better in total against top 5 and against out of conference. I think that out of conference dominance is a little bit skewed. They were plus 237 against their out of conference opponents. So that's where you get this big 95 offensive passing margin that we talked about earlier. It's the biggest one I've ever seen, almost 100 yards more. Well, they passed for plus 237 against out of conference opponents. Texas is better in conference than they were out of conference, plus 56 to plus 52. And in the top 5s were pretty close, plus 73 and plus 67 there. Advantage Washington still when you look at passing, but not nearly as big as it seems on the surface. When you scroll up there, when you talk about these passing margins and you look at Texas and they're 56, and then you go look at Washington and they're 95, that seems like a big jump. I mean, it's 40 yards. But a whole ton of that is skewed by that 237 margin out of conference. Offensive scoring margin, Texas is really consistent across the board in this category. They have a plus 10 total. They have a plus 10 against the top 5 defensive scoring teams on their schedule. They're plus 11 out of conference and plus 10 in conference. So they just scored 10 points more than their opponent just across the board. Doesn't matter who they're playing. Washington, still pretty consistent, not as consistent. 11 overall, 12 against their top 5 opponents. 18 plus 18 against out of conference, and only plus 9 against conference. So they have an advantage here, but it's very slim. And I think Texas is better in conference. Again, against those, what you would assume, most conference schedules at Power 5 programs are a little bit tougher than the out-of-conference schedule. Defensive run margin, Texas is better than all 4. They're better than Washington in all 4 of these breakdowns, and they're strongest against the top 5 best rushing offenses they've played and in conference. So their margins are bigger against the better teams. Defensive pass margin, Texas is slightly better than Washington in 3 of the 4 breakdowns. Washington was significantly better against the top 5 passing teams. So when you compare Texas's passing margin, defensive passing margin with Washington's defensive passing margin, Washington's a minus 44 against those top 5 teams on their schedule. Texas is a plus 31 against the top 5 teams on their schedule. So not only a wide gap, but you definitely never want to see positive. Texas did not play very good pass defense in a few games in conference, and that's why that margin is the way it is. Defensive scoring margin, again, Texas is better in all 4 breakdowns than Washington. Final thoughts as we on this portion of the deep dive. Texas is clearly the better defensive team. Washington's better passing, but Texas is a lot more balanced. And I think what we're going to see now that we've kind of looked at these stats a little bit is there's a lot of interesting matchups when you look at just these stats. I mean, I think you look at the Texas defensive line against the Washington offensive line in the passing game. 32 sacks for Texas, only 11 allowed by Washington. What's going to give there? You look at this dominant Texas run defense against the Washington run game it's statistically better against the top 5 run defenses they've played. So that's good. I mean, you look at the top 5 teams they've played against the run, and they've done really well against those. And then I think you look at these 82 tackles for loss for Texas to only 46 allowed by Washington. So I think this Texas defensive line versus this Washington offensive line is probably one of the most key matchups in this game. I think you flip it around on its side. Washington defensive line against the Texas offensive line. Washington is negative in defensive run margin. Texas is positive in offensive run margin. 57 tackles for loss for Washington against 66 allowed by Texas. 19 sacks by Washington against 26 allowed by Texas. So again, these strengths for each team are going up against a weakness of each team. And we'll just have to see how it all plays out in the end. But I think those are two very key. If y'all listen to this show at all, you know, offensive line and defensive line to me, and I've been saying this for years, that's where you win football games. If you have a dominant offensive line and a dominant defensive line, the skill players do not matter. Period. I think another key matchup in this game statistically, Washington pass offense against this Texas pass defense. Texas gets a few guys back. They get Ryan Watts back, who's a very big and physical cornerback that's been, he was out for a few games, and then he came back and got hurt in the Texas Tech game. Hasn't played since. He's a big guy, man. He's like 6'2", 6'3", 200 pounds. Very long, very hard to throw against. They put him on that boundary cornerback position, and there's just not a lot of room to the boundary because he's so big. Then you got Manny Muhammad and Terrence Brooks that have played really well in his absence. And those guys have played both on the boundary side and the field side cornerback positions. So Texas is one of the only, well, they may not be one of the only teams, but they don't flip cornerbacks. They play to the boundary and they play to the field. And that's just the way it goes. They don't follow wide receivers around like some teams might. And then I think another guy Texas is going to get back he's played, but he's been really banged up. Ethan Burke at that edge position. This dude had knee surgery at some point during the second half of the season, set out a week, I think, and then was back in the mix practicing. So there's a lot of key matchups there that I think when you just look at it, just numbers wise, they're going to pop out. And I think it'll be interesting to see how those matchups go in this game and how much of what data we just talked about really has an impact. Sometimes it has absolutely none. Sometimes you do these things and what you just said and what the numbers say, it don't make a shit. And so we'll just have to see if that's how this one plays out. Sean's 4 big questions of the game. This one's kind of, I don't know. It came to me this morning. Are we getting set up for like a low scoring game when everyone expects this to be a high scoring game? Obviously both these offenses are really good. They score over 30 points a game. They score almost 40 points a game each. And I think the consensus is that we're going to see a lot of points in this Sugar Bowl. But I think the other thing, both these defenses are both pretty good. And I think, Texas holds a notable advantage head-to-head statistically. But I still think you look at this Washington defense, and I think they're capable. I don't know if they will, but I think they're capable of slowing down Texas. You look at the last year's matchup between these two teams, it was pretty low scoring. 27-20 was the final score. Texas held Penix to his second lowest total on the season with just 287 yards passing. His lowest was 229 against Colorado in a 54-7 blowout where he only played like 2 drives in the second half. Washington averaged 35 points per game coming into that Alamo Bowl. They averaged 37.7 coming into this Sugar Bowl. So not that much difference. We've seen games in the past in these big bowl games or national championship games where we thought, man, there's going to be a lot of offense. Both these offenses are really good. And what we kind of end up is seeing either one defense step up just huge and completely shut down the other offense. And we've even seen games where both defenses stepped up big and you had relatively low scoring affair. I mean, one that pops out to me was like the 2000 national championship game between Florida State and Oklahoma. Both those offenses were really good. And I think that national championship game was like 13-7 or 13-6, something crazy. And then I think you look at opponents this year. Washington State, Oregon State, and Arizona held Washington to 24 points, 22 points, and 15 points, respectively. I think, Texas probably has a better defense than Washington State, Oregon State, and Arizona, and probably by a big margin. So we'll have to look at that a little bit, and we'll do that tomorrow on the show. I think question 2 is, can the Texas defense stop the run and force Washington to be one-dimensional? Washington isn't really known as being a big-time running team, but they do average 28 attempts per game, and they do average 4.5 yards per carry. I think you look at Penix's, really gaudy statistics, and you look at it and go, man, that's like an air raid offense. They don't run the ball hardly at all. When they do, they might get lucky and pick up some big gains, and that's really the only reason they run it. I don't think that's right. I mean, they're not a huge running team, but I think they want to run the football some. I think that's part of their philosophy on offense is to do some things with the run. And then, of course, the question is, well, why in the hell would you not want them to run? Why wouldn't you want them? Why would you want to force Penix Jr. to beat you? And I think the answer to that one is pretty simple. It's easier to play defense when you know what's coming. If you can make an offense one-dimensional by either scoring a lot of points yourself and putting them in a hole, or just absolutely shutting down one piece of their offense, it's easy to know what's coming. The other thing, you look at their offensive line. I mean, they give up less than 1 sack per game. If they can stay balanced, it's going to be really hard for that Texas defensive line to get any kind of pressure on the quarterback. But knowing what's coming will allow this Texas defensive line to just rush the passer. And Penix isn't a very mobile guy. I mean, he's got a negative rushing total this season on the season, and they only given up 11 sacks. So he's not a big runner. He's not like completely immobile, but I don't think he's going to hurt Texas. I don't think this is a situation where Texas needs to put a spy on him or anything like that. I think this is a game where you can use that spy to get another guy putting pressure on him in the backfield. Question number 3, can the Texas run game continue to produce big numbers without Jonathan Brooks? Texas is a running team, and all that means is they want to be able to run the ball when they want to run the ball. And I think it's pivotal for this Steve Sarkisian offense to be able to do that. They succeed on the ground. It helps tighten up the defense so they can hit shots over the top. It allows Texas to manage games late. Like, Steve Sarkisian wants to get a big lead in the first half, and then he wants to run the ball, shorten the second half, get it out of there. He's not going to continue just passing the ball all over the park in the second half. And the big difference between this team and teams past at Texas was they couldn't run it. Well, now they can run it. And since Brooks's injury, Texas is averaging over 200 yards per game on the ground. That's really good. Washington is like average at best against the run. I think if Texas can run the ball consistently in this game, you're going to see them make big plays in the passing game. They're going to be able to outscore Washington. I mean, I really like their chances to outscore Washington if they can have a good showing on the ground. And then finally, question number 4, can Quinn Ewers stay hot? He's coming off a career performance in the Big 12 title game where he completed 35 of 46 attempts for 452 yards and 4 touchdowns. By the way, those 4 touchdowns came in the first half of that Big 12 championship game. The Alamo Bowl last year against Washington was Quinn's best yardage game of the season. He was 31 of 47 in that game for 369 yards and a touchdown. And they missed on a ton of deep balls in that game. So those stats could have easily been much more gaudy. On the season, Quinn Ewers is 248 completions on 341 attempts. That's 73%, folks. That's really freaking good for 3,161 yards and 21 touchdowns. That's despite missing 2 games this season. And then this is where Washington's really not good. Their pass defense is ranked 120th at 130 teams. So I think obviously if Ewers is hot, they can score on anybody. But if Ewers is hot in this game, they're going to put up a ton of passing yards and a ton of points on Washington's defense. We'll talk a little bit more about some. I want to talk about like comparative defenses, comparative offenses that these teams have already played. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow on the show. Random college football thoughts. And this is usually just some crazy news or something somebody said that was really crazy and stupid or whatever. But check this out. And I'm not going to say this young man's name, but it's already out in the papers and I said the papers. People still read the papers, man, but it's all over the internet already. But I'm not going to repeat this young man's name. Alabama offensive lineman arrested and charged with knowingly passing on an STD. This is so bizarre to me. First of all, I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know you could be charged for doing that, like if you did it. And I'm like really torn on this thing. Stay with me for a second. Like, how do you prove that someone knowingly did that? Like, so is the act of just having unprotected sex with somebody knowingly passing on an STD, or do you have to have the intent that I'm going to pass this STD to this person? It's just a very it seems like it would be something that would be really hard to prove, but also something that is not going to be hard to get a conviction on or whatever it is. Like, I don't know any of the legal piece behind it. Like, but doesn't the partner have to assume some sort of risk for having unprotected sex or agreeing to having unprotected sex? I don't know. It's just, this is a really weird deal. Now let me say this. Like, I probably sound negative on this, and it probably sounds like I'm just like making an excuse for the guy. I'm really not trying to do that. I absolutely feel like a situation where someone's running around giving people AIDS, like knowing, like, I've got AIDS. I don't tell people I'm having unprotected sex with people. I think that's criminal. This one is just kind of, I don't know, man. I don't know that there's ever been a case like, I mean, surely there has. I've just never heard about it or paid attention to. This is going to be really interesting to see how this thing plays out. I hope we get some closure. Yeah, just bizarre. FSU still throwing a temper tantrum about not being in the playoff. It came out today that they are starting the process to leave the ACC. And this is something we've been hearing about for a while. But listen, being in the ACC did not cost Florida State in this whole playoff committee and getting left out of the playoff thing. FSU played and beat 2 SEC schools this season out of conference. You know what cost Florida State? Being on their third string quarterback. That's what cost Florida State. And that isn't changing regardless of what conference you're in. I get being pissed off about this Florida State. Trust me. If I was on a team or coached a team that was 13-0 and a conference champion of a Power 5 conference, and I didn't make it into the playoff, I would be livid. But all you people in Florida and all you people that are affiliated with Florida State that just like won't shut up about this need to grow up. Like, just shut the fuck up. You are not the first team with a legitimate claim to a playoff spot to get left out of the playoff. It's happened multiple times. It's happened probably every single year that we've had a college football playoff. It will happen every single year that even after we expand it to 12. There's going to be teams around the 13 and 14 range. They're going to have a legitimate claim to be in the playoff that didn't get in the playoff. Shut up, grow up, stop throwing a temper tantrum. The ACC was not your problem. The Big Ten or the SEC ain't going to fix your problem. Join us on Friday, which is tomorrow, and also Christmas Eve. for more on this Sugar Bowl matchup with the Washington Huskies. I'm sure some more random news will come up. Maybe one of these guys we're holding out to sign will sign. We'll talk about that. Check out the podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find us on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube at Horn Takes. Follow and subscribe, man. It won't cost you guys a thing. We appreciate the support. Email us at horntakespodcast@gmail.com with all your questions, comments, concerns, and criticisms. I love them all. You guys have a good Thursday and a good Christmas Eve. Y'all get hooked.